confession of vows in 1986, then did his theological study in San Antonio. After final profession in 1991, Father studied spirituality in Spain for a year, then was ordained in 1992. After ordination, he was soon moved to New Orleans to become student director. He also taught at the seminary there until 1997. From 1997 to 2002, he served as provincial, and in 2002 was made superior at Mary Lake Monastery in Little Rock. From 2005 to 2008, Father Bonaventure served as parochial vicar at the Basilica of the National Shrine of St. Therese in San Antonio and as editor of the Apostolate of the Little Flower magazine. Since 2008, he has served as O.C.D's provincial delegate. Currently, in addition to serving as the delegate to the O.C.D.S., he serves as Provincial Communications Director, a new position in the province, and also as the Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors for the Carmelite Institute. So let's extend a warm welcome to Father Bonaventure.
You were going through all those dates. I was thinking two very significant dates in my life that you left out. Was less than a year after I was ordained, my father died in '93. And then my mother died 2 years ago, so I'm an orphan. And those are big dates in the life of all of us, yeah. Probably bigger than where I graduated and all that stuff. Well, in a humorous vein, I give all of you permission. Oh, here we go. I'll try and speak loud.
No, that's all right.
Yeah. I can slip into a kind of FM voice, and we can sort of ease into midnight with some smooth jazz. But I'll try to speak up. I was going to say that I give you all permission to say yes to Jesus, and that's when, of course, you're in prayer and you go. So we've all been there. Yeah. You know, I can't help but think with this lineup of heavy hitters we've had so far, all hitting home runs, I wonder what I'm doing up here. Well, I'm gonna bunt for you, right? I just hope it doesn't go foul. So I'll do what I can. My talk will follow through somewhat on yesterday's presentation on Laudato Si, but my approach is obviously as a Carmelite and with the question of spirituality and the underlying current of spirituality in the document and how it speaks to us as Carmelites. I also have included some things of a somewhat personal nature. I don't know, you can't talk spirituality without getting personal, drawing from your own experience and your own person. Okay, well, as I warm up so he can get my voice right, let me just say one thing. Those of you who were at the movie last night were watching that. You know, one reflection I came away with was that the human brain has 700 trillion possible synaptic connections in it. You know how the brain works with these synaptic connections. And there are 700 trillion possible synaptic connections in the human brain. And that number is not only bigger than the number of stars in the known universe, it's bigger than all the matter in the universe. So, what should I say? Each of us is a walking universe. potentiality of any human being is as large as the universe, if not larger. So the way we treat the universe and the way we treat each other is of one thing. When we diminish, demean, kill, suppress, oppress a human being, we are destroying a universe. And so that understanding is rather, what should I say, unnerving, amazing, and it influences how we treat each other. Okay, my presentation is going to be old school, reading from a text, and I will try. I don't think I can be as charismatic as Father Don, but I'll do the best I can. Okay. If I were to refer to the malaise speech, most of you would probably know what I'm talking about, maybe not the younger ones. You would know either right away or after a little jog to the memory. I'm referring, of course, to the televised speech that then President Jimmy Carter gave in the summer of 1979, a speech in which he never actually used the word malaise, but the speech got branded with that word, perhaps as a way of suggesting a certain un-American quality to it. And then the country's ruling elite, or the ruling economic and political interests, with the willing participation of the news media, moved in and began to disparage, dismiss, even belittle what President Carter was asking us as a nation to consider acting on in concert. In my view, this rejection of Carter's message was kind of the beginning of the end for me. I was a young man at the time, in my mid-20s, and was rather moved by the speech. As I saw it, finally a political leader, indeed the highest, most important political leader in our land, the president, was inviting us to grow up as a nation by accepting some limitations on our lifestyles and some realism in our expectations. The way we are living and consuming now, in other words, our status quo as a society, can't go on forever. We need to live more reasonably, more maturely, and with greater respect for our world. We need to live, in a word, more sustainably, that is, with an eye to others and to our collective future as a nation. Turning the page here. I am kind of nervous, but if you see me shaking, it's because of a nervous condition I have, so, which is not being nervous, it's a condition of my nerves, whatever. So, but I do have a nervous condition in another sense too. But as I said, and as you two no doubt remember, the president's invitation was thoroughly rejected. In fact, in less than a year and a half, we would elect Ronald Reagan, an out-and-out instrument of the present power arrangements in our society, and a spokesman for a kind of unbridled, you can have it all, it's morning in America attitude. Of course, it was all as phony as could be. What we got was a mix of worshipful militarism, excessive financialization of the economy, and the enactment of a supposed trickle-down tax policy that started us on the road to where we are now, to where our nation's wealth and labor trickle up, not down, into the hands of the few, of the 1%. Of course, the 80s were also a time when white privilege, white resentment, and supposed white victimhood sought to reassert itself following the changes towards greater equality won during the 60s and 70s. The same can be said for gender relations. It was a time where many sought to reassert male privilege and its supposed victimhood at the hands of evil feminists and liberals. Thus, when I say it was the beginning of the end for me, I mean that this refusal to attend seriously to what President Carter was saying, to refuse to change and grow up as a nation, and most importantly, to refuse to step outside that bubble of deep denial and blindness that so infects our national spirit, that sent a dagger through my heart. I don't know if I've ever really recovered. I've maintained a certain cynicism ever since that time, unfortunately. As far as this bubble that we live in and refuse to step outside that and look at ourselves honestly, I'm referring to the fact that we live in a nation founded on, well, the ideals we tell ourselves and celebrate as Americans. Meanwhile, in the real world, we are and always have been a nation, or more correctly, an empire, founded on slave labor, on free land had through the genocidal clearing away of the Native American peoples, on the notion of whiteness used to marginalize and dehumanize the other, to name three decisive and determinative evils that permeate our history. Yet we as a people, as a nation, simply can't face and admit these truths, let alone own up to them and allow them to influence and reshape our national identity. Thus, we are stuck in the mud. We remain perpetually adolescent, unable to live in the real world. What happened in 1979 and 1980 has, in my view, led slowly but inexorably to our present situation, in which, faced with major crises needing an adult response, we deny it all and seek rather to fortify our walled-in bubble. Indeed, we proceed as a nation to elect as our leader a narcissist in chief, somebody mentally, attitudinally, and spiritually infantile. You know, to give a simple example of our inability as a nation to step away from the imperialism and triumphalism that lies at the core of our national psyche, let me cite a few words from Laudato Si. Pope Francis is quoting his predecessor, Pope Benedict, from that Pope's encyclical Caritatis in Veritate. To manage, this is the quote, to manage the global economy, to revive economies hit by the crisis 2007, 2008, to avoid any deterioration of the present crisis and the great imbalances that would result, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, food security, and peace, to guarantee the protection of the environment and to regulate migration. For all this, there is urgent need of a true world political authority. Now then, can you imagine how such a passage would be received and reviewed on Fox News by Sean Hannity, say, and what sort of experts he would bring on to comment on how fatally this passage mixes politics and religion or fails to give due place to American exceptionalism, or would lead inevitably to socialism, that great enemy of the American way. Well, that's a grim note to start with. I guess, though, that I'm pretty grim about my country's ability to respond meaningfully and maturely to our present crisis. Thank goodness for China. Really, it's weird. But let me switch gears and move to something more hopeful and pleasant, something more inspiring, perhaps. I would like to take as a starting point for my reflection these words from Laudato Si, When the desire to create and contemplate beauty manages to overcome reductionism through a kind of salvation which occurs in beauty and in those who behold it. Period. I know that's not a whole sentence or a complete thought, but that makes it all the more evocative. What follows? Ideologically, so much of what ails us, as I see it, involves some sort of reductionism. I think that's also the approach taken by Pope Francis, that reductionism is a source of our present ailments, our ideological inability, or blindness, I should say. For that's the approach overcoming reductionism necessary to cultivate any growth of the human spirit. And the crises we are facing today certainly entail a crisis of the human spirit. Indeed, faced with the ecological crisis of our time, our hope lies first of all, before we get to the matter of implementing policies, in calling forth the capacity of the human spirit, empowered by the Holy Spirit, to overcome reductionistic attitudes and worldviews of any kind, grounded as they mostly are in fear, insecurity, possessiveness, selfishness, and instead to inch towards ever greater transcendence, grounded in an experience of ecstasy, that is, of standing outside ourselves and being spiritually present to the other. We must, if our individual and collective spirit is to grow, seek to find ourselves through some sort of going out to the margins and horizons of the individual isolated self, and this experience that is so cleansing, healing, salvific, revelatory, transformative, and holy. In a word, we are to become contemplatives, both in the intimacy of prayer and in the abiding, staying power of a lifestyle, of a character of being. Of course, when I say contemplative, I mean it as a Carmelite means it. But as a devotee of St. John of the Cross, let me gravitate toward another word. The word I have in mind is beauty, as used by Pope Francis, which word is a way of referring to that draw the other can have on us, the draw of other persons, of creatures, of the divine, the ultimate, the other which awakens in us the human spirit. I guess I should say I define the human spirit as a capacity, a potentiality, not as some thing that lives in us, but a potentiality for true transcendence. For example, in the transcendence of love, in which we move beyond the present moment. We move into the life of another person with care, with enduring, faithful, staying, the staying power that is love. That's how I understand human spirit, all those capacities that we have. To return to the quote of Pope Francis, when the desire to create and contemplate beauty manages to overcome reductionism through a kind of salvation which occurs in beauty and in those who behold it. Well, whenever this desire triumphs, what then happens? What comes next? I would say in a word, spirituality. Our spirit awakens to an honest, heartfelt, often heart-wrenching re-examination of our way of being in the world, in our relation to others, to ourselves, to others, to the events unfolding around us, potentially to all creation and beyond, the divine, the eternal, to what we can know of the ultimate. These are the dimensions of our human spiritual existence, always transcendent to us because ever drawing us on into a real living relation to the real world, not to some imagined or conceptualized world. As Pope Francis says on 2 occasions in Laudato Si, quoting his own prior exhortation from the Joy of the Gospel, realities are always greater and more important than ideas. Just as I would add, spirituality is greater and more important than theology, because it is about our lives in the real world, our real lives, as it were, and not those lives we imagine in our heads. Further, I would say that it's not a huge step, nor just a play on words, to go from the term spirituality, as we in Carmel would commonly understand it, in all its richness, to a term that takes us into the heart of the message of Laudato Si. The term I have in mind is, as you may have guessed, ecology. Pope Francis defines ecology thus: ecology studies the relationship between living organisms and the environment in which they develop. Moving then specifically into the realm of human life, human ecology might be called one, anthropology, but also a kind of spiritual anthropology. And the environment in which we develop can, of course, be looked at from a variety of perspectives and interests, but spiritually, religiously, it is the environment of grace, of sacrament, or as in spirituality, of the immanent yet transcendent, the already not yet environment of the Holy Spirit. The notion Pope Francis develops in Laudato Si that seems to me closest to our Carmelite notion of spirituality is finally his expression, an integral ecology. Let me quote a passage that captures this notion well. Pope Francis writes, "An integral ecology includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with creation, reflecting on our lifestyle and our ideals, and contemplating the Creator who lives among us and surrounds us, whose presence must not be contrived, but found, uncovered." We are speaking of an attitude of heart. This is Pope Francis still. We are speaking of an attitude of heart, one which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present to someone without thinking of what comes next, which accepts each moment as a gift from God to be lived to the full. In my work with members of the Discalced Carmelite Secular Order giving retreats and days of recollection, whenever I speak with them about the practice of recollection and the experience of contemplation in our prayer lives, I usually try to move the discussion, after giving due attention to prayer, from prayer to how prayer changes us, transforms us, if indeed it is authentic. One way I try to get a handle on that question of prayer's effects is to ask, in so many words, okay, we practice recollection. We receive brief moments of contemplation. But are we becoming recollected and contemplative persons as a way of being, as a matter of character? In doing so, I've struggled to come up with a simple, concrete, and easily graspable understanding of what being a contemplative person might mean. Well, upon reading Pope Francis's understanding of a truly integral ecology, as quoted above, it seemed to me that I'd finally found the best such statement, precise and expressive, that I've run across. Let me read it again to indulge you and ask if you also don't agree. An integral ecology includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with creation, reflecting on our lifestyles and our ideals, and contemplating the Creator who lives among us and surrounds us, whose presence must not be contrived but found, uncovered. We are speaking of an attitude of heart, one which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present to someone without thinking of what comes next, which accepts each moment as a gift from God to be lived to the full. I don't know if I think if I met someone like that, which I have met some people, I would say here is a truly contemplative person whose character, whose attitude of heart, whose way of being in relation to others and the world is truly something that is born of the fruit of the contemplative experience of God, of being in the presence of the living God. Sort of, the great biblical experience of Saint Elijah in the cave on Mount Horeb. And after all the bustle and the destruction, God goes by with the sheer sound of silence. That's what the Hebrew says. Not a murmuring breeze, but the sheer sound of silence. And then Elijah goes to the mouth of the cave and buries his head like that. That's a wonderful story of the contemplative experience of God. Okay, moving along. So there you have the profound spiritual underpinnings of Laudato Si, and what ultimately is the spiritual crisis of our age, which it strives to address. A crisis manifest, for one, in our abuse and looming destruction of God's creation on this planet. Personally, I'm not at all optimistic about the willingness and spiritual capacity of my generation, the baby boomers, to, I told you I have a nervous condition. I drop things all the time, so I'm constantly going to a chapter of faults. The willingness and spiritual capacity of my generation, the baby boomers, to respond to the ecological crisis, both individually and collectively, by initiating some movement, some simple gesture toward an integral ecology in the vision of Pope Francis. There we go. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes, although the post-industrial period may well be remembered as one of the most irresponsible in history, nonetheless, there is reason to hope that humanity at the dawn of the 21st century will be remembered for having generously shouldered its grave responsibilities. While I share his first sentiment, I have my doubts about the second, at least in this country. But as the saying goes, where there's death, there's hope. It is with the millennials, I believe, that one finds hope. Of course, the jury is still out, but that's where we who are associated with the religious institute and with the charism it embodies, alongside those many others who are leading an intentional, countercultural, spiritually purposeful lifestyle, that's where we come in. While we may not be able to do a whole lot ourselves on the big stage, we can still give at least personal witness to the younger generation by seeking to inspire and enlighten them out of our spiritually vital, contemporary, and authentic lifestyle, indeed if we're living it, of which Carmel is or can be a prime example. Or is that too Pollyanna-ish, do you think? Sometimes I wonder. Depends what side of the bed I get up on. Be that as it may, Laudato Si itself offers a simple example of how Carmelite spirituality might be reinterpreted in terms of our present ecological crisis. Pope Francis sums up nicely the little way of Saint Therese in these words. Saint Therese of Lisieux invites us to practice the little way of love, not to miss out on a kind word, a smile, or any small gesture which sows peace and friendship. And integral ecology is also made up of simple gestures, which break with the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness. And just as Saint Therese sought to believe firmly that these hidden, out-of-the-way acts of love can have universal import, helping to keep alive that love that is the pulse beating at the heart of the Church, so Francis wants us to believe that our meager personal acts on behalf of the environment, as insignificant and seemingly pointless as they may appear, will not in the end count for nothing. He writes, personal acts of trying to live simply and sustainably benefit society, often unbeknown to us, for they call forth a goodness which, albeit unseen, inevitably tends to spread. Furthermore, such actions can restore our sense of self-esteem. They can enable us to live more fully and to feel that life on earth is worthwhile. I want to continue along this line of reflection. How can the simplicity of life and detachment of heart that characterizes our lives as contemplatives in Carmel give living witness to an integral ecology, such as the human race is called to if it is to survive? Or better yet, if it is to be itself, that is, to be human in its God-given vocation to cultivate the earth. By the same token, this connection between simplicity and detachment and an integral ecology might give some indication of how the call of Pope Francis to take up the vision of an integral ecology could serve us Carmelites as a way of reinterpreting our contemplative lifestyle in terms relevant to the ecological crisis we face today. Of course, any evangelical lifestyle, any lifestyle that is born of the grace of God's coming kingdom, has simplicity and detachment as essential aspects of it. Pope Francis in Laudato Si acknowledges this fact, of course, as well as its relevance for how Christians are to play their part in the spiritual renewal humanity must either undergo or perish. He writes, Christian spirituality proposes a growth marked by moderation and the capacity to be happy with little. It is a return to that simplicity which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things, to be grateful for the opportunities which life affords us, to be spiritually detached from what we possess, and not to succumb to sadness for what we lack. But in Carmel, simplicity of life and detachment of heart have a certain specific Carmelite tenor to them. They flow from and receive their place and purpose through a specific central defining reality at the core of our spirituality. I mean, of course, contemplation. I would say as Carmelites, by virtue of our vocation, we are all called to be contemplatives. No Carmelite is sort of unique. These Carmelites are the contemplatives, and these are the not contemplatives. By virtue of our vocation, that is to be presumed. And if we're not becoming contemplatives, we're failing our vocation somehow. And that goes for seculars and lay Carmelites as well. As Carmelites, we are contemplatives, or at least we're called to be, and everything else comes from and returns to that vital center. Thus, for example, our practice of detachment is not fundamentally an ascetic practice, but but a contemplative one. And between these two, there's a difference of some importance. Here is how St. Teresa defines detachment in the way of perfection. Detachment is the grace to give ourselves to the all entirely and without reserve. Interestingly, she takes what is at root a negative idea of letting go or casting away, and she defines it in a positive light, as a giving of ourselves over to and a living a life of steadfast relationship with the transcendent all of our existence. Likewise, Teresa sees detachment as part of a living whole, all of which has to do finally with love of God and love of neighbor. She writes in The Way of Perfection, "I cannot understand how there can be humility without love, or love without humility, nor are these two virtues possible without detachment from all creatures." Both of these two, the positive orientation and the holistic setting, seem to me essentially Carmelite and derive from that living root of our spirituality, contemplation. So with that in mind, I don't know why I did this, but I did it. Instead of talking about Carmelite detachment, simplicity, and humility in more or less conceptual terms, as if these words represent abstract ideas, is one of the issues I have in spirituality, is to find ways to go through, but beyond the conceptual way of thinking, as if, these are all ideas that we are supposed to have. And the one way that's close and important to me to try and do that is through the instrument of poetry. I wish to take another route in order to approach this aspect of our tradition as I try to understand and reinterpret it through the lens of Laudato Si. By another route I have in mind, of course, are those, of course, to those who know me, poetry. Our spirituality is captured as much in poetry as it is in treatises on the spiritual life or expositions on this or that issue in the life of prayer. So, to give expression to our Carmelite tradition, I'm going to look at a few poems. One by John of the Cross, of course, as you'd expect. Secondly, by Teresa, as you might not expect. And then I want to conclude with a poem by that wonderful American Carmelite poet, Jessica Powers. We don't think of Teresa as a poet, and perhaps rightly so. Her verse, much of which has probably not survived, was for the most part occasional, important to her life in the monastery, but not to her work as a spiritual writer. She did write a couple of poems that are true spiritual lyrics. One of them pops up in two of her letters. She sent it to her brother Lorenzo and describes for him the moment of prayer that gave birth to it. She is even rather proud of this poem, although she commands her brother not to share it with anyone. The poem celebrates an experience of the beauty of God. That is, that quality of God's presence that draws us out of ourselves and into its mystery and wonder. It overwhelms us, so to speak, bestowing love beyond measure, and so transforms us from the nothingness of the individual isolated self into the eternal being of one in union with its creator. Here's the poem. Before the beauty of God. O beauty, exceeding all other beauties always. Though hurting, you wound me not, and painlessly you undo the love of creatures. O knot that binds two things so unequal, why do you unbind yourself, since bound you give strength, turning evils to good? Unite her without being to you without end. Finish without finishing. and without having to, love. Make great this nothingness. Not a bad poem, actually, right? The poem reminds me of a petition found in the prayer, A Prayer for the Earth, which Pope Francis composed for the conclusion of Laudato Si. The petition reads, "Bring healing to our lives that we may protect the world and not prey upon it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction." The grace of contemplation bestows wonder. It stirs up an interior gratitude simply for being alive and for being able to share life with others. It brings to our awareness with a certain immediate, unquestioning power, a sense of that connectedness with creation that we experience as bestowing upon us divine blessing, healing, as empowering us to love. To speak of it, of contemplation, as a moment of being before the beauty of God is as good a way as any. From our contemplative experience as Carmelites, then, we can feel a rapport with certain passages or expressions in Laudato Si. They seem to speak to us in an almost personal way. One such passage for me was the following. By learning to see and appreciate beauty, we learn to reject self-interested pragmatism. If someone has not learned to stop and admire something beautiful, we should not be surprised if he or she treats everything as an object to be used and abused without scruple. While the concern here is not immediately ecological, it obviously pertains to that all too pervasive modern mentality with its stuntedness of spirit that lies at the root of our continued abuse of creation in both its human and non-human varieties. Here, in such a context, detachment can be understood as a capacity to cherish, to admire, to see another in himself or herself. Detachment leads us away from that almost universal narcissism that projects onto everything its need for self-gratification and self-glorification. That's one of the reasons why I personally found the election of Trump as president so distressing. He seems to me a supremely narcissistic individual, someone whose world is small, cramped, petty, and ultimately empty. And I don't want to think that our collective national psyche is somehow finding for itself a leader and eminence in such a man. Turning to the poetry of St. John of the Cross, Pope Francis makes it easy for me. He references those famous stanzas from the spiritual canticle where the bride celebrates the bridegroom upon their first finding of each other. You know the passage. It reads, "O my beloved, the mountains and hidden wooded valleys, fabled islands and roaring rivers, the whistling of love-laden breezes, the night's utter stillness at the first streaks of dawn, hushed music, far echoing emptiness, the supper that refreshes and delights. Our bed as gentle as flowers enlacing lions' dens, draped in purple and set upon peace, canopied with countless gold shields." Pope Francis alludes to this passage when he imagines the poet, and he has in mind John of the Cross, the poet as a mystic standing enraptured before a mountain. Standing awestruck before a mountain, he writes, the mystic cannot separate this experience from God and perceives that the interior awe being lived has to be entrusted to the Lord. That simple statement is for me one of the finest, most succinct statements of what a true nature mysticism is all about. It's not that we divinize nature in some strange way, nor that we somehow perceive the divine as radiating out of, but distinct from the natural world, like a ghost in a dead body. Rather, experiencing the beauty and sublimity, grandeur and mystery of nature as present in itself, we then spontaneously entrust our interior response to God in his transcendence. Not infrequently, I'll get it, there can be in spirituality a tendency to interpret our experience by boxing it in, by defining limits for it and forcing it to conform to them. Often this entails setting up a dualism of two opposing categories. From my experience teaching spirituality to seminarians, interesting experience, you should try it. From my experience teaching spirituality to seminarians, the most common dualism is that of matter and spirit. Thus, our experience of the divine partakes of the supernatural, the spiritual plane of existence, which lifts us up above the concrete material world of our ordinary lives. Accordingly, our spiritual life remains mostly a kind of devotional abstraction. Such a spirituality is not capable, I would say, of helping us as Christians and as Carmelites to take up the challenge of an integral ecology as we so need it today. Pope Francis recognizes this problem as well. He writes, for example, "Admittedly, Christians have not always appropriated and developed the spiritual treasures bestowed by God upon the Church, where the life of the Spirit is not dissociated from the body or from nature or from worldly realities, but lived in and with them, in communion with all that surrounds us." The spirit of Carmel has fallen prey to such dualisms. When I hear some of the older friars of my province reminisce about their days in formation back in the 50s, it reminds me of that observation by Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, that in the post-Tridentine church, the model for life in the monastery and for seminary formation was either a military boot camp or a prison. The recalcitrant will, which is to say the natural will, had to be driven out and replaced by a docile, that is, supernatural will. Not the healthiest spirituality, if you ask me. I'm glad, I never experienced it, I didn't live in that time. I've just heard about it. But the way of the true contemplative, and certainly St. John of the Cross is a prime example, is not ultimately a withdrawal from creation, but an immersion into it as a vital, intimate presence, there to find the divine spirit, healing us, loving us, blessing us, accompanying us. Laudato Si insists that Carmel be true to its Holy Father by remaining clear about our groundedness in the created world, there where grace abounds. I can't leave St. John of the Cross behind without quoting once again from the Spiritual Canticle. Here are stanzas 33 and 34 from Redaction A, actually, I miswrote B, from Redaction A, which in my view are the climactic stanzas of the poem. The bridegroom speaks of the union now achieved between himself and the bride. The imagery is lush and very much of this world. Yet, as an expression of love for God, providing us an enduring communion and groundedness in his loving presence, it seems to me unexcelled. Now the little white dove has borne her green branch to the ark. And look, the turtle dove has found his heart's mate down near the grassy riverbank. All alone she dwelt, and alone has now built her nest. Alone he leads her, he, her dearest one, who alone like her bears a wound of love. There is a certain paradoxical aspect to this life of the Spirit. The Spirit is in the world, of course, and he is with the world, but he is not of the world, at least not exactly. He is of the transcendent, the eternal, the yet to be, the all. But that is the nature of detachment and humility, ultimately the nature of love. When we love someone, we are certainly not indifferent towards them. We are not detached in the sense of disengaged, uncaring, uncommitted, adopting a live or let live attitude. Yet at the same time, we are not controlling, possessive, fearful, insistent, demanding guarantees and rewards in exchange for our love. We all know this distinction well. An integral ecology, then, is a way of thinking about this love only now writ large. We see ourselves as part of something larger than ourselves, whether it be our families, our communities, our societies, the human community as a whole. And here is perhaps where Laudato Si represents something new, pushing the vision of our human vocation to build up a loving solidarity in ever wider and wider, more inclusive circles, ultimately our circle of a loving care and concern is to embrace that community of life, which is our planet. Everything is interconnected, Pope Francis writes, and this invites us to develop a spirituality of that global solidarity which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. Do we see ourselves then as bringing love to our ever-expanding circle of belonging? Can we be part of the whole in a way that is deliberate, free, willing, and given over to love? A couple of quotes from Pope Francis will reinforce this truth. The needed spiritual conversion underlying an integral ecology entails a loving awareness that we are not disconnected from the rest of creatures, but joined in a splendid universal communion. As believers, we do not look at the world from without, but from within, conscious of the bonds with which the Father has linked us to all being. Another passage. Fraternal love can only be gratuitous. It can never be a means of repaying others for what they have done or will do for us. That is why it is possible to love our enemies. This same gratuitousness inspires us to love and accept the wind, the sun, and the clouds, even though we cannot control them. In this sense, we can speak of a universal fraternity. Now to a poem by Jessica Powers. I'll assume you know who she is. The poem, I think, is one of her finest. It reads, "To live with the Spirit. To live with the Spirit of God is to be a listener. It is to keep the vigil of memory earthless and still. One learns to catch the stirring of the Spirit, strange as the wind's will. The soul that walks where the wind of the Spirit blows turns like a wandering weather vane toward love. It may lament like Job or Jeremiah, echo the wounded heart, the mateless dove. It may rejoice in spaciousness of meadow that emulates the freedom of the sky. Always it walks in waylessness, unknowing. It has cast down forever from its hand the compass of the whither and the why. To live with the Spirit of God is to be a lover. It is to become love and like to him toward whom we strain with metaphors of creatures, fire sweep and water rush and the wind's whim. The soul is all activity, all silence. And though it surges Godward to its goal, it holds as moving earth holds sleeping noonday, the peace that is the listening of the soul. I prefer to leave these reflections there in the quiet resonance and aftershock of this extraordinary poem, so much of the spirit of Carmel. None of us can solve the ecological crisis we face as a species. Some of us may have a larger role to play in our Carmelite response to it. All of us as Carmelites can live as fully as we can with the Spirit. And that may be all we need. At least the Lord will find faith, hope, and love alive in this world if and when everything falls apart. Thank you very much.